to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we really appreciate you joining us for today's episode. Has the Dyatlov Pass mystery been solved? In part 2 of our look at this incredible and confounding story, we will speak to Alexander Puzrin, one of the authors of a brand new article in the Communications, Earth and Environment Journal entitled Mechanisms of Slab Avalanche Release and Impact in the Dyatlov Pass Incident in 1959, which has been making international headlines over the past couple of weeks. Has a key element of the mystery finally been solved, or does it open up even more questions and nightmares? We will hear directly from the source. But before we get to that, we are very proud that this is our 100th regular episode of Haunted Talks. The first episode came out on May 28th, 2015, and it has been quite a ride since then. We have presented gripping ghost stories, weird and unsettling mysteries, dark history, and all sorts of topics in between. Whether this is your first episode or your 100th, we are thankful for each and every one of you in our spooky family. Thank you for spending some time with us over these years. If you have listened to almost every episode, please email me so I can personally thank you. And my email is jim@hauntedwalk.com. While it is my voice you hear, I don't do this alone. Most importantly, I would like to thank our talented audio editor, my partner in crime, and soon-to-be wife, Michelle Dennis. Her contributions to the show cannot be overstated. Finally, I would like to thank everyone in the Haunted Walk family for supporting the show, mentioning it after tours, agreeing to be guests, and generally helping in a variety of ways. If you would like to help us celebrate, please consider sharing the show with anyone you know who enjoys the kind of content we cover here. Last week, I mentioned it would be awesome to get to 100 reviews on Apple Podcasts for our 100th episode, and several of you have stepped up and left reviews, so thank you for that. And now we are just a short few away. Perhaps you can be the one to push us over the top. For more information about our online audio experience, The Haunting at Home, or our virtual haunted campfires, which will be returning Saturday nights starting February 20th and run through to at least the end of March, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. Our first haunted campfire of the winter season will be all about Ottawa's haunted mansion, Laurier House. I will be hosting, and I hope to see some of you there. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident such a compelling story is that the deeper you go, the more mysterious it gets. Trying to assemble all of the different puzzle pieces has been an act of frustration. As soon as you put one piece in place, suddenly there are several others that no longer seem to fit. If you are not familiar with the story, I would suggest listening to our previous episode before proceeding, as there is much to cover and try to make sense of. But briefly, let me remind you of some of the bizarre puzzle pieces at play in the Dyatlov puzzle. 9 skiers cut their way out of their own tent in the middle of a freezing and windy night of 20 degrees below Celsius and proceeded to walk around 1 kilometer down the mountain toward the tree line. Despite the adverse conditions, they made this walk without proper clothing, leaving essential survival items behind in the tent, in particular, their boots, as many were walking in socks or bare feet. There were no signs of an avalanche when the search party arrived, and the location they camped at was not overly steep, and avalanches have not been commonly reported in the area. Bodies were discovered in 3 locations. 3 members of the team, including Viktor Dyatlov, were found between the tree line and the tent, as if they had been making their way back to the tent but were unable to complete the journey. 2 members were found at the tree line around the remains of a small fire, but stripped down to their underwear. A tree at that location showed branches broken up to 5 meters or around 15 feet in height, despite other easily more accessible firewood in the area. Did someone climb that tree? And if so, why? The other 4 members of the team were discovered in a nearby ravine several months later, along with a makeshift shelter or snow den. These members were better dressed than the others and seemed to have repurposed articles of clothing from the 2 victims that had died by the fire. 3 members of the group had significant injuries, which may have caused or sped up their deaths in the cold. And these injuries included broken ribs, a cracked skull, and internal injuries. One of the victims' clothing was slightly radioactive. And around this time, there were reports by other eyewitnesses of strange lights in the sky around the area. With all of these puzzle pieces, it is difficult to tell which ones deserve the most focus. Obviously, we know that some of them must be red herrings and only adding to the confusion. As I have pondered this mystery over the years, there are 2 questions that haunt me and represent what I believe are the pivotal moments in trying to understand what occurred. The first is what happened in those initial moments of the incident that caused the group to cut their way out of their own tent. The second is, if the group was able to get everyone out of the tent, why would they not grab their boots and additional clothing before heading out into the snow and wind? Or why did they not return to get them later? Those are the 2 questions we are going to focus on today. And lucky for us, we have one of the co-authors of a brand new groundbreaking and headline-making report that may go a long way to help solving the mystery.
I'm Alexander Puzrin. I'm a professor and chair of geotechnical engineering at ETH Zurich. It's a Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. My main field of research is geohazards, in particular landslides. And in particular, I have been interested in a so-called progressive failure, when a landslide takes place not immediately after it is triggered, but sometime after that. And this interest led me 2 years ago also to look into snow avalanches, delayed snow avalanches. And that's how I got involved in the snow avalanche research.
And as far as choosing this case to work on with your co-author of the paper, were you already aware of the Dyatlov mystery, or what drew the 2 of you to kind of apply your academic pursuits to such a well-known unsolved tale?
I was born and I grew up in Russia. I left Russia 30 years ago, and at that time, this was still Soviet Union. I didn't know anything about Dyatlov. This information was not available. But I learned about it about 10 years ago, and of course I was fascinated about it. But at that time I was not working on avalanches. I knew that avalanche was one of the hypotheses. And in general, I think on my own, I would not probably dare to put my foot into this mess. But John Gum, my co-author, he was actually a reviewer of my first paper on delayed avalanches. And in 2019, he got contacted by a New York Times reporter who wanted his opinion on the avalanche hypothesis of Dyatlov incident. The reason New York Times reporter was interested was because a Russian prosecutor general in 2019 reopened the case 60 years after the incident, because the original investigation in 1959 was inconclusive. It was talking about some irresistible force of nature that killed him. So a reporter called John, and John started reading, and he realized that this was a delayed avalanche because the group cut the slope just before the sunset. But the avalanche apparently happened 10 to 13 hours later. And John knew my interest in snow avalanches, and he also knew that I can read Russian. He called me, and we decided to work on the case together.
Now, avalanche has long been suspected as playing a role in what happened to the group that fateful night. However, those theories have always faced some questions because of a number of factors. In particular, there were no signs that an avalanche had occurred when the rescuers did arrive, some 23, I believe, or so days after the fact. And the slope of the mountain where they had pitched their tent was not overly steep. Now, your research indicates something called a slab avalanche could have occurred with the setup they were using that night and the environmental conditions. Could you explain to us what a slab avalanche is, and what were the unique conditions the group may have faced on the mountain that night that could have allowed one to occur?
Slab avalanche is exactly what it is. It is a snow slab, maybe about 50 centimeters in the case of Dyatlov group. So it's 50 centimeters thick. And it is snow frozen together, snow crystals frozen together, pretty stiff and also pretty heavy. We are talking here about probably 400 kilos per cubic meter. So below the slab, you often find a weak layer, a so-called depth hoar. So this is also snow, but this is snow which is not frozen together. These are reasonably large single crystals of snow. And this is, therefore, it's a weaker layer. And if conditions allow, the slab will slide over this weaker layer and will cause a slab avalanche. Now, with respect to conditions, yes, indeed, what you mentioned were 2 out of 4 main arguments against snow avalanche. The fact that the slope was around 23 degrees, which is too low for a slab avalanche. Slab avalanches, as a rule of thumb, can take place at the slopes at around 30 degrees and above inclination. And second, that indeed, when you talk about an avalanche, and you come to the place where avalanche has happened, you expect to see some traces. You expect to see a tension crack where the slab detached when you look upslope, and you expect to see the pieces of the slab lying around. And this people couldn't see. Of course, you were correct. They came 3.5 weeks later. And there were strong winds. So probably some remnants of the slab could be blown away. But also there was no distension crack. So this we tried to see if such an avalanche still could happen. And what helped us, we looked very carefully at the topography of the place. And we could see that actually this topography had steps. And these steps, they are like, I would say, of the scale of 10 meters. They were covered by snow. And when snow covers steps, you do not see really the steps anymore because you see kind of an average slope. And this average slope was about 23 degrees. But terrain itself, above the place where they pitched the tent, was more like 30 degrees. And the weak layer does not follow the snow surface. This weak layer follows the terrain. So the surface of the slab was at the inclination of the 23 degrees, but the bottom of the slab was more like 28 degrees. And this weak layer was 28 degrees. Therefore, it could slide. And the second consequences of this special geometry is that the slab was thinning upslope. Okay, if the top is 23 and the bottom is steeper, it will become thinner and thinner as you go upslope. And this explained two things. First of all, why they really couldn't see a large crack above the tent. And the second, that the slab was not that large. It was about 5 by 5 meters. And this explains why the slab injured them, but not really killed them. But this is probably going to be your next question.
Indeed it is. But before I get to that one, there is obviously the famous picture of when the rescuers found the tent. And I mean, as far as my research indicates, I believe that that photo was taken very shortly after the tent was found. But one thing that strikes me about that photo, which still shows the skis kind of acting as tent poles in that scenario, is the top of the tent does not seem to be covered with that much snow. And I'm wondering, does that line up, though, with the slab avalanche? Do we think just the snow that was originally deposited there has been moved by the wind? Or how do you see that photo in relation to this potential explanation of what might have started the events?
It's a good question. And here I have to rely on what other researchers who believe in avalanche hypothesis say. Because there are a lot of people who think that this was avalanche. In the end, it appeared to be also the official version of Russian prosecutor general. They try to explain what you just said by the following sequence of events. That first of all, we indeed see that one of the poles of the tent survived. The explanation is that the slab did not hit the whole tent. The tent was pretty long, 4.5 meters long. So the slab did not really hit it in its entirety. It hit maybe half of it. And over there, the poles were broken. With respect to the skis, these skis, what people believe, were lying around and were preventing people from an access. So they did the most natural thing they could, the rescuers. They took them out of the way and stuck them in the snow. But, this is already speculation. We do not really have a proof of that, but this is the common view of what people who believe in avalanche hypothesis say.
To recap what is being suggested, when the group made their camp that night, they cut into the snow to make themselves a windbreak, as the wind was really coming down from the mountain. This cut, combined with a large pack or firm slab of snow sitting on top of a looser pack directly above the tent, caused the conditions where a slab avalanche could occur. If it did occur, as it would be a fairly small and localized avalanche, there may not have been obvious signs for the rescuers to discover when they arrived 3 weeks later and found the tent. I think it is also important to pause and reflect for a moment what that moment would have been like if the avalanche occurred. After several days of hard skiing through the wilderness, the group sets up their tent, enjoys a meal as the winds continue to lash and howl outside. Sometime later in the evening, perhaps after they had gone to bed, An ominous, deep rumble would have been heard, followed almost immediately by a car-like piece of solid snow and ice, suddenly crashing through half of their tent, at least momentarily, sealing them all inside. We can only imagine the confusion, panic, and terror that would have followed. It makes my skin crawl to even think about. Well, let's return to more of the hard science as we try to explain or look at one of the most mystifying elements of the story, which is the injuries that were sustained by members of the group, including fractured skulls, missing eyes, and internal trauma, more reminiscent of what we might expect in a car accident. And your modeling explored the possibility that a slab avalanche could have caused those injuries. And I thought you used a very interesting technique from the automobile industry. I wonder if you could tell us about that process you went through and what you discovered about the potential of the slabs being responsible for previously what were thought unexplainable injuries.
Before we started working on the injuries, it was another mystery to be solved. And this was this delay. Why did avalanche take place 10 to 13 hours after they cut the slope? Normally, you cut the slope and get the avalanche. But the weak layer in this case was not so weak. There was still a bit of strength there. So in order to fail the slab, you needed additional loading. Normally, this loading comes from the snowfall, but there was no snowfall that night. Instead, there was a pretty strong wind. And here, there was another unfortunate feature of the topography. 100 meters above the tent, there was a kind of a flat area. And when katabatic wind, the wind which blows down the mountain due to gravity, meets such an obstacle, it shifts the snow around. So the wind shifted the snow from that area just above the tent. Snow slowly accumulated, and we managed to show that the wind velocity observed in nearby weather stations was sufficient to deposit enough snow after 10 hours to fail the slab. This also gave us a dimension of the slab, the thickness of the slab. So now, with this slab, of which we knew dimensions, we could see if this slab, when it's finally, the weak layer loses its strength and the slab slides down, whether it would be sufficient to cause the injuries that were observed in forensic investigation. Now, my colleague, John, he has a very interesting computer program. It's computer code which is based on the computer code which was used in the animation film Frozen by Disney. So John went there, talked to developers of the code, because the snow looked for him incredibly realistic. And he took this code and he improved it by putting more realistic mechanical snow and mathematical snow model into it. So we had this instrument to simulate dynamics of the slab. And we could put a human body below the slab, or simulate this human body below the slab in this code. The problem was, how do we know parameters of the body? And I talk about mechanical parameters, its stiffness, its strength. And the second, how would we know which force caused by avalanche could cause these injuries, broken ribs and broken skull? So we were ready to do the simulation, but we needed to calibrate this model against some real life experiments, and we never thought that we would find something like this. But a careful search of literature helped us to find some papers from conferences in 70s about the car safety, where General Motors performed tests on human bodies, on dead bodies. They managed to get about 100 dead bodies, and they hit these bodies with flying objects of different weight with the different velocities. And we could actually compare our simulations with these experiments. And we saw that the force that would be acting, this dynamic force, would be acting on the body from the avalanche was comparable to the results of these tests where people had serious but not fatal injuries. So this helped us to confirm that indeed this avalanche could cause observed injuries.
Let's move to a little bit more of a subjective look at things, branching off from the research you've done. It does seem you've shown that it is certainly a possibility, given the conditions, that a slab avalanche could have occurred, and that avalanche could have been responsible for the injuries that we see. But of course, part of the mystery that still seems to be unanswered, and I'm wondering if you can connect it to your research, is why the skiers did not return to their tent before they froze to death. We know they had time to where two of the bodies were found, they had built a fire, so we know they had time to do that. Another group that were found a little further off had time to construct a kind of a shelter. Is there anything involving a slab avalanche or the environmental conditions that night that you think would have prevented them from coming back? Because I can't keep coming to you, if it's a 50 centimeter thick slab that came down, would they not be able to follow their footsteps back to the tent and get additional clothing? Or do we think the wind conditions were such that they got lost and disoriented? How do you make sense, I guess, of the next part of the story, which is beyond your research, and you clearly indicate that in the paper? But what are your thoughts or theories as to what explains their decisions that evening?
Again, I would have then to rely on the theories which people who believe in slab avalanche put forward. But I will be honest with you, they also seem plausible to me, although there is no hard scientific evidence behind them. So what people believed happened after the slab surprised them. First of all, not all of them were hit. Actually, severe injuries got only 3 of them. But of course, the tent was broken. And to free themselves out of the tent, those who were not injured, they had to use their knife and to cut the tent from outside. Then they freed their friends, injured friends. And again, there were very strong winds. It was extremely cold. It was minus 25 degrees. They were not appropriately clothed because they were sleeping in one huge sort of communal sleeping bag, and some of the shoes were left in the tent on the snow. So they had to make a decision what to do next. And one option would probably be to start digging the tent out and the things out of the tent, but probably they were afraid that they would trigger more avalanches. So it seems the decision was to find a shelter, and the closest shelter was a forest which was about 1 kilometer downhill. And also there was another circumstance there. In this forest, the day before, they made a kind of a storage of the stuff they were planning to use later in their journey. They put some spare food there, spare clothes, equipment, and so on. So it can be that they decided to go down to the forest to find a shelter, in particular for their injured friends, because it was not possible to restore the tent. The tent was destroyed. And apparently they got lost because conditions were horrible. It was extremely cold. The winds, the same winds that were bringing snow down to load the slab behind the tent, were also blowing the snow further down. So it was hard. But they managed to get it to the forest. They managed to create kind of a floor to put the injured friends. They cut some small trees and branches, but they could not find their storage. And therefore, it seems that some of them still decided to go back to the tent, and 3 bodies were found at different distances from the tent, facing the tent. So the short answer to your question is that they wanted to find a shelter, they wanted to find the stuff that they left before, they couldn't. They put the injured friends in the safe place, and they tried to make it back to the tent, but everybody in the end died from hypothermia.
That's certainly something I've been giving a lot of thought to. If they felt it was unsafe to return to the tent, to get the supplies, is clearly the only reason they wouldn't have done it. With slab avalanches, is it likely there would have been, additional slab avalanches occurring within the same time period? Because you do point out it was the unique conditions of how they had cut the tent in. So I'm just trying to grasp, would they be hearing other rumbling? Would they see other avalanches that kind of occurred at the same time? Or how likely would that be?
Honestly, I do not know. Try to put yourself in their place. Okay, at the moment they were just got hit by this. And apparently only half of the tent, so the slab destroyed half of the tent. There was another half of the tent which was still okay, but potential slab above it was also intact. So it is difficult. I don't know how much of the knowledge of these slab avalanches these people had at the time. And I will be honest with you, right? Sometimes people say that, let me put it this way. Sometimes people do not like this slab avalanche theory because it kind of puts the group in a bad light, that they were inexperienced and they did something wrong, they caused an avalanche and they died because of their incompetence. I think what our research shows that this is not true, that there were several features they didn't out, and even with us, after we discovered these features, it took us and the snow science about half a year to put everything together to be able to explain it. So I'm not sure, first of all, that they could envisage that, but they faced the fact. Again, if this is exactly what happened, I would be scared as well. And I guess it was also not so easy. Okay, they could probably get the stuff out. But what are they going to do? To stay for the rest of the night on the slope? Because they could not rebuild the tent. It was broken, it was cut from inside. They needed the shelter. So I don't think there is anything extraordinary about them leaving the tent, in particular if they had hope that they will replenish their supplies downhill. And the rescuers later did find their supplies.
Alexander Puzrin makes a compelling case. An avalanche occurred to start the incident, which inflicted serious injury on at least 3 members of the group in those first few seconds. In the chaos, the group made the tragic decision to walk down the mountain. Due to the confusion of the event, the windy conditions, and it being so late at night, they ended up going the wrong direction and never found the supplies they had stashed for their return trip. Once they got down to the tree line and were unable to find the cache, they lacked the strength to walk back 1 kilometer uphill to get back to the tent, and all of them subsequently perished. The logical part of my brain does whisper to me that this may be the most likely explanation. Where I struggle is given the very cold conditions that night, and that the group knew the tree line was a significant distance down the hill. Would they choose to set out without anything on their feet? Especially when they were just able to get all 9 people successfully out of the tent. The communal sleeping bag, let alone appropriate footwear and jackets, could have easily made the difference between life and death. Surely they would have been aware that hypothermia can set in within minutes, especially if there is exposed skin, as was the case with many of their feet. It is unfair to try to put ourselves in their place, and of course, hindsight is always 20/20. But if I had to choose between getting my boots and jacket and risking an avalanche in the process, versus walking a kilometer in the middle of the night when the temperatures were so cold without basic clothing, hoping to find supplies when we got there, I imagine I would choose to start digging and then head down as soon as possible afterward. Again, we know they all got out of the tent, and that the tent was still visible out of the snow when the searchers found it several weeks later. Why they did not grab more supplies before heading down the mountain is a mystery that will forever haunt this story. Trying to understand the psychology and the fear that they must have been feeling is almost elusive as every other element of this story. For the first time, though, we have solid science showing that an avalanche was possible in the area, which was previously thought impossible, and also without leaving any signs of its presence. But just because an avalanche could have occurred does not mean that one actually did. I'd be curious, obviously for our audience, your work in this particular area is interesting in, examining the mystery, but I have to assume that this kind of modeling could have real-world ramifications, and particularly, I assume, in safety on mountains. Is that correct?
Yes, you're right. Of course, we are not going to stop here. I think, of course, we are not going to find another fascinating mystery like that, but what we created, the models that we built, they first of all are going to help to better understand the mechanisms of natural avalanches, which are caused not by skiers or by machine or by explosion, but simply by accumulating the load on the slab. And second, the dynamics model will help us to investigate effects that avalanche impact can have on the human body and on structures. So this research will continue.
Well, Alexander, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today about your work. If our listeners and kind of are interested in following your career and what you might be doing next, is there a good place where they can do that?
Sure, they can Google my last name and they will come to the website of my university and they can send me an email.
A very special thank you to Alexander Puzrin for his time, and it was just exceptional to hear his first-hand account of his research and the ramifications for the mystery overall. Thank you, of course, for joining us. If you do have your own theories about what occurred, please check out our posts on social media about the episode. I would love to hear what you think after hearing Alexander Puzrin explain it as he thinks it may have occurred. Be interested to hear what you think. Are you now satisfied that the avalanche explanation does neatly wrap up the case? Or do you still have some nagging doubts about that particular explanation? As always, thank you to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.filmmusic.io for the additional music. For information about our Haunting at Home or virtual haunted campfires that are coming up every Saturday night, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And if you can help us break through that 100 review threshold on Apple Podcasts to help us celebrate our 100th episode, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.